I hope everybody's having a great and wonderful day. We have been at this for some time now. This is actually our fourth book talk. And if you'd like to see any of our book talks in archive, you can go to my YouTube channel, which is Church Love 333, and you can check out our archive there under the playlist Reflections on Race, as well as the playlist MLK Uncut. We did close to about 50, a little over 50 days studying MLK's work. Everything he had to say, from civil rights to police brutality to peaceful protesting to what the philosophy of the actual nonviolent movement was all about. So those are actually on my YouTube channel, Church Love 333, and you can search my playlist for MLK Uncut, and you'll see the archive of videos there. All right, so we are back today with our reflections on race through the book White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. We are both live streaming today through our YouTube channel as well as through Periscope, and we are headed into our next section of reading, where we are reading the life of Tim Wise. And Tim Wise, in case you do not know who he is, you can look him up through the internet, Google, YouTube. He's an anti-racism activist, and he has pretty much been fighting white supremacy, white privilege, those kinds of things for most of his professional career. So this book actually chronicles his personal life, chronicles how he has lived as a white man in America, even though he is Jewish, but he is basically talking about the concept of whiteness and what it means to be white in America, and how that whiteness has privileged him throughout his life. So this is what we are reading. Good morning, good morning. This is what we are reading through, and we are on the section talking about his professional life. And he has, yesterday we covered the fact that he had just gone through and been privy to, or been party to, setting up a living space for one of our former presidents. And he talked yesterday about the fact that because he was a white man, and it was, two young white people that was on the job, nobody really questioned them. Nobody really asked for identification. Nobody really, they kind of took for granted that they were, just all American kids who couldn't possibly have any nefarious things in mind to harm the president. And what he was saying is that kind of thinking, because they were white, right? They were presumed innocent. They were presumed not to be dangerous. And so that's where we are picking up now after this show, after this opportunity. We're going to read on and see what happens. He's trying to get his career off the ground at this point. And so we are going to see what happens after his talk show appearance of meeting with racists. Here we go. Though the Jane Whitney show had only been seen in about 35 markets, and thus my television debut had been witnessed by a pitiful small number of people, there was one person watching that evening upon whom I had made a significant impression. I received a call at our Houston apartment a week after the show aired from a man in South Haven, Connecticut, who told me his name was Coach Jimmy Jackson. Coach Jimmy, as I would come to know him, had quite a story to tell, and felt that I was just the person with whom he could share it. Normally, this would have been the kind of thing that I would have likely blown off, humoring him until he got tired of talking, and then politely saying goodbye, never to speak again. But there was something about Jimmy that struck me as genuine and kind. Furthermore, his story of discrimination rang true for me, such that I offered to take a closer look and do whatever I could to help. Jimmy Jackson had been everything from a cop to a recording artist with Buddha Records back in the late 1960s. He had also joined the New York Jets in 1966, only to suffer an injury in training camp, thereby ending his football career before it had started. But mostly what he wanted me to know was that he was a football coach and a darn good one, having won 2 national semi-pro championships, been in 3 semi-pro Super Bowls, compiled an overall winning percentage of 73%, and having been voted General Manager of the Year and 3-time Coach of the Year in the minor leagues. Why all of this mattered was that Coach Jimmy was in the process of suing the National Football League and the fledgling World League of American Football for racial discrimination. The World League had formed a few years prior as an experimental operation within teams in the US, Canada, and Europe. But despite his impressive accomplishments and the recommendations he had received from persons like Jack Pardee, head coach of the NFL Houston Oilers, Gene Burrow, former GM of the New Jersey Generals, legendary quarterback Johnny Unitas, and Tim Rooney, director of personnel for NFL Giants, Jackson had been passed over for a coaching gig with the league. Not only had Jackson been hired for a job in the World League, no black coach had been, despite the claims of the league director that a diverse coaching pool was among their top priorities. Jimmy promised to send me the supporting materials for his lawsuit, and I promised I would look them over. When the packet of information came, I have to say, I wasn't immediately sold on the strength of Jimmy's case. He had representation, a pretty established law firm in downtown Manhattan, but all he had for me at the time were some clippings regarding his prior coaching experience and some publicity materials he had put together, as well as various articles about discrimination in the NFL, including one piece from Sports Illustrated, which detailed the difficulties that African Americans were having obtaining jobs on the sidelines. Still, and despite the paucity of hard evidence up to that point, I enjoyed talking with Jimmy and felt there might be more to the case. So I insisted that he stay in touch as his attorneys proceeded through the discovery phase of the lawsuit and to let me know what they had come up with. I would be glad to serve as an expert consultant of sorts if his lawyers thought I might be of some assistance. Of course, I reminded Jimmy on numerous occasions that I was only 23, the mere professor of a bachelor's degree, and could in no way be presumed an expert on discrimination the way many others could. So I explained he might want to get someone with more formal credentials to serve as an actual expert witness come time for trial. But Jimmy would have none of it. He had seen me on Jane Whitney and felt that I was the right person for the job. I thanked him for his confidence and promised to do all I could. Though there would be no pay for any of the work I did over the next 2 years on Jimmy's behalf, ultimately that work would become some of the most important I've ever done. If not for Jimmy, then certainly for myself. Indeed, my involvement with Jimmy would ultimately serve as the best education I could have received about how racism works. Excuse me one second. Gotta warm up those vocal cords. Specifically, at the institutional level, in fact, my work on Jimmy's case was one of the few high points during a period of my life in which most everything else was going wrong. From mid-1992 until late 1994, my professional life would remain in constant crisis mode. We would leave Houston in September, excuse me. Something in my eye. Sorry about that. We would leave Houston in September to return to New Orleans, but although I had more connections there than in Texas, I still had no luck finding activist work upon getting back. Broke, unemployed, and unable to contribute anything to the household that Nicole and I shared, I found myself desperate enough at one point to sell off my treasured baseball card collection, which I had cultivated as a youth. Although the cards were worth about $30,000 then, and sickeningly would be worth nearly $500,000 today, I felt as though I had no choice, ultimately letting them go for only about 15% of their value at the time. I also took a job in early 1993 as a stock boy at a local store until finally landing a research position with economics writer and author Walter Mead in June. But even during the work with Mead, for which those of us hired to assist him were paid $200 a week, and even then never on time, I was far more interested in Jimmy's case than anything Walter had us looking up on international trade and development policy. By mid-93, this lawsuit was in full swing, and over the next several months, Jimmy's attorneys would depose the principals from the other side. They would load me up with deposition transcripts to look over, as well as internal NFL and World League documents uncovered during discovery. Whereas the initial materials he had sent me left quite a bit to be desired, the new document seemed a treasure trove of useful evidence. Though WLAF officials claimed to be concerned about the lack of black coaches in professional football, they had passed up several opportunities to hire African Americans for the league. Jimmy was only one of the black coaches ultimately ignored by team GMs and the league itself, which had hiring authority over the clubs in Barcelona and London. Rather than hire any blacks who applied for head coaching jobs with the World League, several of them were assistant coaches in the NFL by that point. Teams ultimately stocked up on white has-beens, most of whom had failed in previous positions. So, for instance, Sacramento hired Kay Stevenson, formerly the head coach of the Buffalo Bills, but whose record had been so bad that he failed to land another job after being fired several years earlier, and who was selling real estate in Florida at the time of his hiring. Likewise, Montreal hired Jacques Dassault, who had previously served as an assistant for two failed Canadian Football League teams, and Raleigh-Durham hired Roman Gabriel, a former quarterback with the Los Angeles Rams, but who had been working as the GM of a minor league baseball franchise at the time of his hire, and who had only coached briefly at Cal Poly Pomona, a school whose football team was so bad it had been disbanded after Gabriel's tenure there. Although the league claimed in its defense that it had made offers to black coaches, a careful examination of those claims suggested the offers had been in bad faith and were more to keep up appearances of fairness than to truly bring diversity to the professional coaching ranks. Offers were made to three coaches in particular: Dennis Green, at that time the head coach at Stanford; Tony Dungy, at that time an assistant coach with the Kansas City Chiefs; and Milt Jackson, a veteran wide receivers coach in the NFL. But Green and Dungy were already being groomed for NFL coaching jobs and were known to be within a few years of securing such positions. As such, there was very little chance that either of them would have taken the risk of joining an experimental league for less pay and prestige and potentially derailing their professional trajectory. In fact, Green had told league president Jerome Vanisi that he had no interest in coaching in the WLAF. As for Milt Jackson, he had made it clear that he would only accept an offer for the Sacramento franchise because it would allow him to live close to his family. But rather than even interview him for the Sacramento job, the league offered him the position in Barcelona, knowing there was no way he would accept it. To see how the league and its team GMs continually moved the goalposts, jiggling the job qualification requirements, and relying on old boy networks in a way that worked to benefit of whites and the detriment of blacks, was an incredible lesson in the way institutional racism operates. Far from the bigotry of David Duke, this was slick and systemic racism, the kind that had worked to marginalize not only Jimmy Jackson and other black coaches, but millions of black job applicants across the nation in any number of professions for decades, ever since the passage of civil rights laws. Now let me pause there, because think about that for a moment. And I know personally in the profession of education that this is true. People are always talking about how there is a job shortage or there is a shortage of qualified teachers, right? And I had to explain to someone, even on yesterday, there is not a shortage of qualified teachers. I'm going to say that again. There is not a shortage of qualified teachers. There is a shortage of schools willing to hire qualified teachers, especially teachers of color. It is more beneficial to them to keep substitute teachers in a classroom that may not even be familiar with the class subject, but they are cheaper to obtain. Substitute teachers are cheaper. Substitute teachers, most of the time, get paid less. Substitute teachers, you don't put on contract. Substitute teachers work day wages. Substitute teachers, you don't have to worry about insurance bills. So again, these are systemic ways that people get around actually doing what is right by people who have gone to school, gotten a college education, come out, qualified themselves, taken the necessary tests, gotten the necessary licensing, and they still cannot get a job in their field because of how the system rolls. So he makes a really good point here that even with the NFL, it's to me, it's very obvious that there's something going on in the NFL when 60 to 70% of your players are Black. But you rarely see a Black head coach. Ding, ding, ding. That should tell you something is going on. What happens to all of the Black players that retire? I see a lot of white players that retire. They go on to be coaches. They go on to be spokespersons on sports networks. So again, that income for them continues to keep on going. But like he said, these companies move the goalposts. They jiggle the job qualification requirements. They keep people hanging on a string, and they continue to pretend like they want diversity when in fact their policies show otherwise. So we won't keep reading. Even more instructive was the way in which the league had employed a hiring criteria that, while facially race neutral, was guaranteed to produce a racially exclusionary impact on Black coaching aspirants. So according to Jerome Benisi, the league had been looking for coaches with experience in one of three prior arenas: either as head coach of a pro team, head coach of a top 50 college program, or as an offensive or defensive coordinator in either the NFL league or short-lived United States Football League. Of course, as I would explain to Jimmy's attorney, such a criteria, excuse me, something is in my eye and I don't know what it is. It's still bothering me. Sorry about that. As I would explain to Jimmy's attorney, such a criteria, even assuming the WLAF had been using it, rather than just going with the personal preferences of the white GMs, could not but produce an all-white outcome. At that point, there had never been a Black head coach or offensive or defensive coordinator in a professional league. And the only African-American coach in a top program was Dennis Green, whose success in the college game ensured he would be holding out for a much more prestigious NFL gig. The World League certainly knew that the criteria would have that effect, so it seemed reasonable to conclude that their intent in using it had been to produce the disparate impact that was predictable from the start. But with or without intent, the exclusion of Black coaches would be the result of such criteria. This is what I call racism is spelled P-O-L-I-C-Y. I hope you got that. Racism is spelled P-O-L-I-C-Y. See, I don't have to tell you that I'm not going to hire Black people. All I have to do is create the criteria that excludes you. And it happens in every profession. And so a company on paper, as he's saying, A company on paper can say, we're not racist, we're not discriminatory, we just have qualifications, we just have criteria. But when you form your criteria in such a way that you automatically know that based on what's out there, it's going to exclude Black people, that is institutional racism. Okay? So just in case we didn't understand how racism works when you create policies that specifically exclude a group of people, in this case, Black people. It was a perfect example of institutional racism, which allows racial disparity to be produced and maintained with or without the deliberate and bigoted intent of those producing the disparity, but merely as the product of normal operating procedures so common to employers. So often the way in which qualification requirements are used favor those who have been in the pipeline for the best opportunities previously. Because of historic white privilege, relying on so-called experience indicators or seniority, as is normative on the part of most companies, will almost always screen out people of color who, through no fault of their own, haven't been afforded the same opportunities to accumulate these credentials over time. It's not unlike having an 8-leg relay race in which one runner has had a 5-lap head start, and then the runner who started out behind fails to catch up and surpass the one with the unfair advantage, blaming that second runner for not being as good as the first. Though the case seems strong to me, sometimes circumstances work against the desired outcome in ways that can't be easily avoided. As it turns out, American jurisprudence on racial discrimination law makes it very difficult to prove a case without clear evidence of intent to injure. Although it is possible to sustain a case of disparate impact without proving intent, typically courts require such cases to involve huge classes of plaintiffs, statistically large enough to demonstrate a clear disparity over a period of time. In the case of the NFL and World League, the potential numbers of injured Black coaches would have only been in the dozens, and the case before the court was not on behalf of even that many, but rather only Jimmy. So the judge classified the action as a disparate treatment case, meaning that the burden would be on Jimmy's attorneys to prove that the league had deliberately excluded him from consideration because of race. Although I felt there was still strong enough evidence to suggest disparate treatment, ultimately the jury would disagree. By the time the trial was held, Jimmy had ballooned to over 400 pounds, his health suffering from the emotional impact of the mistreatment to which he'd been subjected, striking a visual that no doubt would make it difficult for any jurors to see him actively coaching a team from the sidelines. That and the evidentiary limits imposed by the court created long odds for Jimmy that he ultimately couldn't overcome. I felt terrible having taken this ride with him for so long, only to see it end in defeat. I was especially upset that his attorneys hadn't warned me about the evidentiary rules for expert witnesses, rules that make it quite clear such witnesses are not allowed to testify to the ultimate issue, in this case, whether or not the defendants had engaged in unlawful discrimination. Having not been advised as to what I could and couldn't say, I had prepared an expert report in which I said in no uncertain terms that I thought the defendants had discriminated, a position I would repeat without hesitation at my deposition, much to the delight of the opposing attorneys, who were then able to successfully have me struck from the case for having overstepped the boundaries of expert testimony. Whatever I knew about racism and discrimination didn't matter. It was what I didn't know about the evidentiary standards of the American legal system that would make the biggest difference. It was the only time I would ever regret not having gone to law school. Still, what I'd learned about the way racism operates on the institutional level had been worth the experience, whatever the outcome. We're coming into our last section for today. Other lessons would be forthcoming during this time too, specifically lessons about whiteness and its consequences, even for white people, which were nearly as disturbing as the ones I had just learned about its effects on folks of color, thanks to the Jimmy Jackson case. Back in late 1991, amid the generally heightened racial consciousness that had emerged thanks to the David Duke campaigns, and he's talking 1991. So ask yourself, why was David Duke last night at a historically black college campaign? That's something to think about. New Orleans Councilwoman Dorothy May Taylor had proposed a citywide anti-discrimination ordinance aimed at the prestigious private clubs that paraded during Mardi Gras. The parade crews were targeted by Taylor because the clubs did far more than just throw parties every Lenten season. They were also the location of substantial business dealings and high-powered connections, ultimately linked to the opportunity structure in the city. Among the old line elite crews, it was also known that they had never had black or Jewish members.